properties of the venom of the Sonoran Desert.
Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House, New Mexico, working on oil painting contact. Alright, today on this, I am going to work on the tree. So I've got several variations of brown, of burnt umber, burnt sienna, red ochre, and then a fleshy tone made out of some sienna and white. So I'm just going to start layering up texture and form on the tree face and thing. And also, if anyone has been following my Gabor Mate playlist, apologies, I posted In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts as When the Body Says, or no, I posted When the Body Says No as In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. Sorry, I was trying to dance around my tripod here. It's a little pulled back next to my other painting. So I'm rebuilding In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. Part 1 and Part 2 will be up shortly, retaining the X-Files framing and using my art as slides. Yeah, I must have been playing a video game and building the other one simultaneously or something. I don't know what the fuck happened. But anyway, I just noticed that last night as I was checking through the end of When the Body Says No, and I started up In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts and discovered that it was the identical audio, so I fucked up royally on that. My bad. So anyway, here we go on this for now.
It was very hard to go beyond this dose.
And part 2 is processing on my video editor, so it might ding and I might cut this to go take care of that, but this shouldn't be a terribly long session.
Underneath his familiar army sleeping bag. He took this bag with him whenever he traveled, both literally and figuratively. When he would journey on the road, or when he would take a psychedelic drug trip. Cindy and I sat on either side of Nils. I gave him a brief preview of what to expect. He nodded for me to begin. Halfway through the injection, Nils said,
and presently,
yes,
on the background right now is the Rick
Nils turned
Strassman
out to be
Spirit
one of the few
Molecule audio
volunteers
book,
who could taste
which is on my Rick Strassman
DMT
playlist.
as the drug-rich blood rushed through his mouth and tongue on the way to his brain. It was a metallic, slightly bitter taste. I thought, this seems fast enough. My notes are sketchy as to the effects of this dose of IV DMT on Nils. This may have been due to his taciturn nature, or because neither of us were especially impressed with the intensity of the experience. He did remark, however, that 0.2 milligrams per kilogram was maybe 1/3 to 1/4 a full dose, relative to his experience smoking DMT. Perhaps feeling a little overconfident from how easy these first 2 sessions, Philip's IM and Nils's IV, had been, I decided to proceed immediately to triple Nils's IV dose, from 0.2 to 0.6 milligrams per kilogram. My confidence was premature. In retrospect, a more cautious move to doubling it to 0.4 milligrams per kilogram would have been more reasonable. Thankfully, I didn't jump to 0.8 milligrams per kilogram, which would have happened had I followed Nils's suggestion that 0.2 milligrams per kilogram was 1/4 of a full dose. This morning, both Philip and Nils were going to get 0.6 milligrams per kilogram IV DMT. It was sunny, cold, and windy in Albuquerque that day, and I was glad to be working inside. I entered Nils's room in the research center. He was lying under his sleeping bag, awaiting the first 0.6 milligrams per kilogram dose. Cindy already had placed a small needle into a forearm vein, the portal through which I would inject the DMT solution directly into his blood. She sat on his right side and I on his left, where the tubing from the IV line dangled off his arm. Philip also was here. He was scheduled to receive the same dose later in the morning, if all went well with Nils. He sat at the foot of the bed, curious about what Nils was to experience, and ready to provide moral support for all of us. Little did we suspect we'd need him for physical backup, too. I infused the solution of DMT somewhat more quickly than I did for Nils's previous 0.2 milligrams per kilogram dose, over 30 seconds rather than a minute. I thought a faster injection might allow for less dilution of the DMT in the bloodstream. This then would generate higher peak levels of DMT in the blood and, therefore, the brain. After the infusion of drug was complete, Nils said excitedly, "I can taste it. Here it is." Immediately after blurting this out, he began tossing and turning under his sleeping bag. He then sat up with a start, exclaiming, "I'm going to vomit." He gazed at us, stunned and uncertain. Cindy and I looked at each other at the same time, realizing we had nothing into which he could throw up. We hadn't foreseen that our test subjects might need to vomit. He mumbled, "But I didn't have any breakfast, so there's nothing to throw up." Nils became agitated and pulled the pillow and sleeping bag over his face. He curled into the fetal position, away from us and the blood pressure machine, kinking the tubing that connected the cuff to the unit. We could not get a reading at either 2 or 5 minutes, when we knew his blood pressure and heart rate would be at their highest and potentially most dangerous levels. He tried climbing out of the bed with a mostly purposeless flailing of his arms and legs, but this was a substantial mass of limbs in someone 6'4". His hands were cold and clammy as Cindy, Philip, and I joined forces and maneuvered him back into the now too small-seeming bed. At 6 minutes, he retched into a basin we found in the closet.
I believe so, yeah.
Because he had to sit up
to do some of the upper branches
we
as
were
well.
able to reposition him in the bed, and we obtained a blood pressure and heart rate recording. At this point, 10 minutes after the injection, his readings were surprisingly normal. He reached out to Cindy, touching her arm and sweater. It looked as if he were about to stroke her hair, but quickly seemed to forget what he was going to do. Nils then stared at me, saying, "I need to look at you now, not Philip or Cindy." I did my best to look calm, answering his gaze with my own, praying quietly that he would be all right. At 19 minutes, he sat up on his elbows and laughed. He looked very stoned, large pupils, lopsided grin, mumbling incoherently. He finally said, "I think the best high dose is between 0.2 and 0.6. We all laughed, and the tension in the room dropped a few notches. Nils still had his wits about him, at least at that moment. He continued, "There was the movement of the self. I am disappointed that it's ending. It was a cafeteria of colors. A familiar feeling, yes. I've returned. They were there, and we recognized each other." I asked, "Who?" "No one or thing identifiable as such." He still seemed quite under the influence. I did not want to press him. He shook his head and added, "Coming down from the high was very colorful, but it was boring compared to the peak. At the peak, I knew I was back where I had been when I smoked it last year. It was a lonely feeling leaving there. I thought I had gotten really sick. I felt you hovering over me, like I was dying, and you all were trying to resuscitate me. I hoped everything was all right. I was just trying to catch what was happening inside." He paused, then concluded, "I'm tired. I'd like to nap, but I'm not really sleepy." Nils had little to say beyond this, other than that he was ravenously hungry, wisely having skipped breakfast. He ate heartily while filling out our rating scale. So even Nils thought 0.6 milligrams per kilogram was too much. I spent a few minutes in the nurse's lounge, reflecting upon what we had just seen. From a cardiac point of view, Nils's blood pressure and heart rate had risen only moderately, although we missed the readings at their presumed peak. Thus, there seemed likely to be no physical harm from administering 0.6 milligrams per kilogram IV DMT. However, I was not sure if the thinness of Nils's report was because he could not remember what had happened, or because of his style of keeping to himself most of what had taken place. We clearly had broken through the psychedelic threshold. The suddenness and intensity of onset, the irrefutable nature of the experience, the inhabited sense Nils described, all added up to a full DMT trip. But was it too far beyond the psychedelic barrier? Nils was a self-acknowledged hardhead, requiring higher doses than many to attain comparable levels of altered perceptions from the same drug. How would Philip fare? Philip and I walked down the research center's brightly lit hall. We passed Nils at the nurse's station looking for more food. He felt great. It was reassuring to see how well he looked so quickly after his harrowing jump off the psychic cliff. I asked Philip, "Are you sure you want the same dose?" "Yes." There was absolutely no hesitation. I was not so sure. If Philip declined undergoing an experience similar to Nils's, my anxiety would have become more tolerable. Perhaps he would settle for 0.5 or 0.4 milligrams per kilogram. This would be easy enough to do. I could simply stop short of emptying the entire syringe full of DMT solution. While I believed 0.6 milligrams per kilogram most likely was physically safe, the potentially shattering mental effects loomed in front of all of us even more dramatically than they had before Nils's session. However, Philip was not to be outdone by his friend and fellow psychonaut. He was ready for his 0.6 milligrams per kilogram dose. This tendency in our volunteers to persevere even under the possibility of an annihilating psychedelic experience was marked. It was most apparent during our tolerance study, which took place the next year in 1991, in which volunteers received 4 large doses of DMT, each separated by only 30 minutes. Not one volunteer, no matter how worn out, refused that 4th and final high dose of DMT. Philip's desire to take the same dose as Nils confronted me with a scientific, personal, and ethical dilemma. My training had taught me that one should not shy away from prescribing a little too much of a medication if the circumstances called for doing so. For example, very high doses might be necessary for a full therapeutic response in otherwise treatment-resistant patients. In addition, it was important to learn about toxic effects, to be able to recognize them quickly in various circumstances. This latter point is even more important when studying a new experimental drug. It was within my authority and responsibility as the principal investigator of the project to tell Philip I did not want him to repeat a Nils-like 0.6 milligrams per kilogram DMT experience. However, Nils seemed fine now. More importantly, he was the first and only person to get this dose. I had planned on 2.6 milligrams per kilogram sessions that morning so that I could determine if this dose caused similar responses in 2 different people. I liked Philip, and he did want his 0.6 milligrams per kilogram dose. But how much of a role did our friendship play? I didn't want to do as he requested just so that I wouldn't jeopardize our relationship, but I wanted his participation in this early stage of the study to be worth his while. He was, in some ways, doing us a favor. Philip lived far from Albuquerque, and asking him to return once more to get 0.6 milligrams per kilogram, if 0.4 or 0.5 were not a full enough dose, would have inconvenienced him. There were many competing priorities. I hoped I made the right decision by agreeing to give Philip 0.6 milligrams per kilogram. Entering his room, Philip and I said hello to Cindy and Robin, Philip's girlfriend, who were already there, waiting for us. He made himself comfortable on the bed. Another 0.6 milligrams per kilogram IV DMT session was about to begin. Philip's bare and sterile room featured brightly waxed linoleum floors, salmon pink walls and tubes for oxygen, suctioning of secretions, and water exiting from behind the bed. He had taped a poster of Avalokiteshvara, the 1,000-armed Buddhist saint of compassion, on the outside of the closed wooden bathroom door that faced his bed. A television attached by a maze of cables hung from the ceiling, looking down at his mechanized, narrow bed, which was covered with thin hospital sheets. The air conditioning hummed loudly. He lay down on the bed and made himself as comfortable as possible. Cindy smoothly and skillfully placed an intravenous line into one forearm vein. The blood pressure cuff was also wrapped around this arm. Philip's other arm had inserted into it a larger IV line from which we could draw blood, so we could measure concentrations of DMT in his blood after administering it. This line was attached to a clear plastic bag that dripped sterile salt water into the vein, so that there would be no clotting in the blood-drawing tube. Cindy and I sat on either side of Philip, not sure what to expect in light of Nils's earlier reaction. Robin sat off to the side, near the foot of the bed. Philip, fresh from Nils's unnerving session only an hour ago, needed little preparation. He knew what to expect from us while he was lying in his bed under the influence. He had seen that we would help him immediately if he seemed in need of assistance. We wished him luck. He closed his eyes, lay back, took some deep breaths, and said, "I'm ready." I watched the second hand of the clock on the wall, waiting for it to hit the 6, so that I could time the 30-second injection to finish when the second hand hit the 12, which would be time 0. It was nearly 10 a.m. Just as I finished inserting the needle of the syringe into Philip's line, but before depressing the plunger and emptying the DMT solution into Philip's vein, there was a loud, insistent knocking on the door. I looked up, paused, removed the needle from the line, capped it, and placed it on the nightstand next to Philip's bed. The director of the research center laboratory was waiting outside the door. I stepped into the hall out of earshot from the room. He said that the previous blood samples for DMT analyses were collected incorrectly, and that we needed to change how we did this. I told him we would modify our technique accordingly. I let myself back into Philip's room and took the chair by the side of his bed once more. He seemed unaware of the interruption, having begun the inward turning and letting go that we found allows for the smoothest possible entry into the DMT realms. For him, the trip had already begun. I apologized for the interruption and, trying to lighten the mood, said, "Where were we now?" Philip replied with only a grunt. He opened his eyes, nodded for me to proceed, and closed them again. I uncapped the syringe and reinserted the needle into his IV tubing. Cindy nodded that she was ready too. I said, "Okay, here's the DMT." I slowly and carefully began infusing 0.6 milligrams per kilogram DMT into Philip's vein. Halfway through the injection, Philip's breath caught in his throat, sounding like a cough that never quite got out. We quickly learned that whenever this catching in the throat followed a high-dose injection, we were in for a wild ride. Quietly, I let Philip know. It's all in. 25 seconds after the infusion was complete, he began groaning, I love. His blood pressure rose moderately, but his heart rate jumped to 140 beats per minute, up from his resting level of 65. This increase in pulse is equivalent to that which might occur after racing up 3 or 4 flights of stairs, but in this case, Philip hadn't moved an inch. At 1 minute, Philip sat up, looking at Cindy and me with saucer-sized eyes. His pupils were hugely dilated. His movements were automatic, jerky, puppet-like. There seemed to be no one home behind Philip's actions. He leaned toward Robin and stroked her hair. I love. Twice that morning, then, a volunteer in a dazed DMT state attracted to a woman's hair. Niels to Cindy's, Philip to Robin's. Perhaps it was the most powerful image of living, organic, familiar reality available when one looked around the dreary hospital room in such a highly psychedelic state. To our relief, he lay back down without prompting or assistance. His skin was cold and clammy, as had been Nils's. His body was in a classic fight-or-flight reaction. High blood pressure and heart rate, blood moving from the skin deeper into the vital internal organs. but all while he was performing almost no actual physical activity. It was difficult to draw Philip's blood. The high levels of stress hormones caused the tiny muscles lining the veins to clamp down, reducing unnecessary blood flow to the skin. At 10 minutes, Philip began to sigh. How beautiful! How beautiful! Tears began streaming down his cheeks. Now that was what you would call a transcendent experience. I died and went to heaven. By 30 minutes after the injection, his pulse and blood pressure were normal. I was flying within a vastness. There was no relative space or size. I asked, "What did you feel when your breath caught in your throat?" I felt a cold, contracting feeling in my throat. It frightened me. I thought maybe I would stop breathing. The thought, "Let go, surrender, let go," was there for a split second. Then the rush of the drug swept even that away. Do you recall sitting up and stroking Robin's hair? I did what? 45 minutes after the injection, drinking tea and no longer feeling any effects of the drug, Philip could not remember sitting up, looking at us, or touching Robin. Soon thereafter, he seemed comfortable, and we were confident Robin could look after him. Philip and I spoke the following evening. He felt a little run down, but had slept very well. His dreams were more interesting than usual, although not particularly bizarre. Nevertheless, he could not remember any of them. He worked a full 10 hours the next day, although not at full steam. However, he said, nobody but I would have noticed I was tired. Amazingly, these are all the notes I have from that session and the next day's report. This contrasts strikingly with Philip's usually quite eloquent descriptions of his drug sessions. Perhaps his getting through the morning safely was the most important information we needed to learn. Driving home that evening into the mountains outside of Albuquerque, I used the time to think about the day's events. I was glad that both Nils and Philip had emerged intact from their 0.6 milligrams per kilogram IV DMT encounters. However, I had not learned much about what their experiences were really like. Their reports were remarkably brief and lacked detail. Why were Nils's and Philip's reports so sparse? One possibility was state-specific memory. This refers to the phenomenon in which events experienced in an altered state of consciousness can be recalled clearly only upon re-entering that state, and not in the normal one. This happens under the influence of substances such as alcohol, marijuana, or prescription drugs like the sedatives Valium, Xanax, or barbiturates. It also results from non-drug-induced altered states, such as hypnosis or dreams. In Philip's and Nils's cases, this explanation would be likely if they later recalled more of their 0.6 milligrams per kilogram sessions while working with lower, more manageable doses of DMT. However, this did not occur to any extent in either man during their subsequent participation in the project. Another possibility is that Nils and Philip suffered a brief delirium, an acute organic brain syndrome, or acute confusional state. Delirium derives from the Latin de, meaning from or out of, and lyra, a furrow, literally going out of the furrow or out of it. Delirium can result from physical factors such as fever, head injury, lack of oxygen, or low blood sugar. In addition, a profoundly traumatic psychological experience may produce a delirious state, such as what happens in survivors of severe trauma or disasters. I was uncertain to what degree psychological trauma contributed to Nils's and Philip's confusion in and inability to remember much of their DMT sessions. How much was a psychological reaction to the drug's effects, rather than a direct effect of the drug itself? That is, climbing a ladder to view a scene of unimaginable shock value might throw one into a delirious or confused state. But it is not the ladder, but rather the view the ladder provides that is responsible. Was what Nils and Philip saw so bizarre, so incomprehensible, so utterly aberrant that their minds simply turned off to spare them from seeing clearly what was there? Maybe it was better to forget. In either case, whether too much drug or too much experience, whatever 0.6 milligrams per kilogram IV DMT did to these two seasoned psychedelic veterans, it came down to just this: too much. As Philip said later, it was a cosmic blowtorch, a tempest of color, bewildering, like I was thrown overboard into a storm and was spinning out of control, being tossed like a cork. I called Dave Nichols again to discuss the DMT dose. What should be a lower high dose? A reduction to 0.5 milligrams per kilogram would be lowering the dose by only 1/6, while 0.4 milligrams per kilogram was fully 1/3 less. We went back and forth. Well, I wanted to
And
make
there
certain the high
is
dose
also
was getting
the
full
finishing
effect.
of
I did
part
not
2,
want to
which I will
psychologically
post
traumatize our volunteers.
after I get this
I was
squared up.
feeling a little tentative after the day's events with
Alright,
Philip and
but that gets a little
Felix.
more detail and
First,
character
do no
into
harm
the tree man. Here,
is
let me
the
zoom in on
overriding dictum for medicine in general, and even more so for human research. Creating a group of psychically damaged volunteers was not an option. Keeping the effects of Phillips and Mills's 0.6 milligrams per kilogram sessions in the forefront of our discussion, we decided to make 0.4
This is already a very
milligrams per
fascinating book.
kilogram
I've read
the top
chunks of it,
DMT dose for
but
the
haven't
study.
listened to this all the way through yet.
A few days later, I called the early DMT pioneer, Dr. Stefan Sara, to discuss these dosage issues. Dr. Sara
Alright,
had
so
discovered
that gets
psychedelic
the
effects of DMT by injecting it into
tree
himself in his laboratory in
anthropomorphization
Budapest,
happening a little bit
in the
more cleanly,
mid-1950s.
better texture starting to
During
develop.
the first phases
Um,
of human
And I do
psychedelic
think I'm
research,
going to
it was common for
take
the
a
researchers themselves to go
sort of
first.
gray scene,
He now
city
was
scene or
completing
something
a
like
long
that
and
happening and
distinguished
developing
career
into
at
the
US
left
National Institute on
horizon
Drug
line.
Abuse in Washington, D.C.
But still kind of debating
I
that.
asked
And
him,
develop this tree figure first
"Did you ever give
and
too
get the
much
rest of the detail
DMT
tightened
to
up a
your
little bit more
volunteers?"
before I consider that any
Dr.
further.
Sara
But
thought
that's
for
it
a
for the moment. Here, I'll
and
take this
answered
off the
in his
tripod
refined
and get a
Eastern
full
European
view
accent. Yes,
for today's
they
session.
could not remember anything. They could not bring back memories of the experience. The only thing that remained with them was the feeling that something frightening had happened. We did not believe it worthwhile administering those kinds of doses. It is fascinating how many of the themes that would emerge over the next 5 years appeared that December
Alright,
morning
so
when I administered 0.6
got the Hornet developing a little better.
milligram IV DMT doses to Philip and Mills. We hear about near-death and spiritual experiences
figure on the
and contact with them
Lake of
in the
Fire.
DMT realms. I felt conflicting priorities around friendship and
Boat
research
developing a little
goals.
better.
The drawbacks of the hospital setting and medical model quickly were apparent. The
Next
need to get
aura,
full
sit on the
psychedelic
sunflowers.
doses was already tempered by an awareness of their potential for negative
Fire ants need a lot of
reactions.
work.
There was
but
a
they're
far-flung
happening-
network
happening.
of colleagues and regulators who
And
variously
then
assisted the
this,
project.
let's get some good
All
detail
were there
zoomed
in
in on
some
the
form
texture
or
that just
another, and
happened there.
Phillips and Mills's
Really is kind of
0.6
nice.
milligrams per
Ways to
kilogram
go on
IV
this, but I
DMT
like that
sessions.
sort of
Let's now
liquid
turn to the background for
stone
this research. The vast
texture
amount we know about psychedelic
starting to
drugs
develop there.
and the way our science and society have used
Cool.
that information.
But that's it for the moment.
Then
Thank
we
you for
can
watching.
begin
That's
to
Adam Search
understand the
broadcasting from the
role
Mushroom Mansion
DMT
Tiles, New
plays in
Mexico,
our bodies
working on oil painting
and the
contact.
establishing functions
Have a
it
good
may
day,
serve
Earth.
in our